This video is sponsored by PCBWay. I love orks, and for a recent trip to the cinema, I got thinking, what if an ork was bitten by a radioactive squig? Probably nothing would happen. Unless a certain grot began to spread rumors that right before the pain boy disappeared, you definitely probably maybe heard him say that if you got bit one of those, you'll turn into a squig yourself. Naturally, the rest of the boys don't want to seem stupider than some sort of a grot, so they said they definitely heard him say that. Even unfortunate for our ork, the next morning when he woke up, his right foot was that of a squig. And over the next few days, he began to transform into something truly horrifying. Or maybe amazing. The amazing Squig Ork, who's gonna be the champion of the Waaagh. To source the miniature, I chose to go with the Gellarpox infected kill team, just as I did with Orkenstein, but this time going in a different direction for his story. I began removing all the obvious chaos elements that I knew were not going to be a match for my ork, before addressing the most important thing to an ork, his favorite weapon. Initially, I thought perhaps this axe would be good on its own, but we needed something a little bit more special. A while ago, I managed to pick up some Defcoptas on a really good deal, so I was going to be using them for spare parts. At first, I thought perhaps I could attach the blade on top of it, making this some sort of a halberd weapon, but I realized that it was simply far too large on its own, so I ended up removing the axe head entirely. Ideally in this circumstance, you'd be pinning the two parts together, but because the Defcopta blade is simply far too thin, so I sanded down the two parts so they have a nice smooth surface and simply used a bit of Tamiya to connect the two parts together. To my surprise, this thing looked a little bit more like a canoe paddle, and somehow that made it even better. One of the alternative ideas I had was using a bit from a Skitarii weapon to create a connection so it would feel more like a power weapon, but it was simply far too flimsy. I thought about attaching different cables, perhaps going a bit for like a prison theme and attaching a knife to it, but it was overcomplicating a weapon that already looked pretty good on its own, so I shifted my focus to the other parts. And I thought I should address the massive guts hanging from him, because it made the model look far too nurgly. I knew that removing them was going to be a vital part of trying to achieve a true Squig Ork. When I was sanding down the stomach, I really didn't think about the fact that I was also removing all the definition of the muscles and everything else around it. So when I cleared up the dust, I kind of was left with something that looked a little bit too smooth. And I also realized that when removing the guts, I removed a portion of the cloth that were connected to them, so I needed something to fill in that gap, and that is where I found these really nice looking chains. It's not a secret that orks love heavy metal, so this will be the perfect match for him. At this point, I was a little bit uncertain as to what I should do to cover up all the stomach damage, and so I went with the classical method of grabbing a nice big chunk of plated armor and simply slapping it on top of it. Now, underneath that plate, I can definitely tell you for certain, all of these muscles are still intact and perfectly sculpted, trust me. And then I slapped on a bit of Tamiya on top of the area, just to make it smoother. Now, I needed to make a sort of crow nest for my grot, and this piece was gonna be absolutely perfect for that. To my surprise, it did not require any modifications, and it just fit him perfectly. Now for the grot, I wanted to give him something a little bit special. Working for the pain boy, he naturally experimented on him and gave him a head replacement that made him tremendously smarter. Coincidentally, it's about the time he disappeared. My friend said that this ork now looks like the holistic medical advisor to my ork, which I think is a pretty fitting title for this guy. I was so excited about the fact that the shoulder piece fits so naturally, I entirely forgot to measure if the grot would fit on it. As a result, he's hanging mid-air, so I used a bit of a Skitarii weapon to create something that looks a little bit more like a bicycle handlebar, but it was going to be perfect for a grot. Quite honestly, if anything, this made him look even better and the pose even more natural. The classical scenario of necessity is the mother of invention. This did also free up quite a bit of real estate, so I thought this would be the perfect place to place an additional orcish totem representing the clan he's part of,
the Red Skulls,
who are an up-and-coming small Waaagh that is making their way across the galaxy. Next up, we need to address his missing arm. This is where things got a bit challenging, because I need to attach the arm to the shoulder, and the shoulder is entirely missing, and the arm itself is much smaller than the body. I need to create some sort of a transition. Problem is, I'm not really good at sculpting flesh, but there was simply no other way around it. So I began sculpting the closest approximation to what I thought the shoulder of this size would be. But the real challenge really came at the fact that I couldn't exactly figure out where the muscles would be connecting the two parts. After getting the general shape down, I got this really nice looking armor piece, and I was gonna use it to cover up the trapezius connection. While I was attaching it, I also realized that I was missing a big chunk of his back muscle, so I decided to add a bit of putty to that area as well. And the next few ideas were definitely gonna be quite something. Now, several months ago, I began working on my own custom Grimdark vehicle, and PCBWay, the sponsor of today's video, offered to 3D print the entire thing in resin, and the parts finally arrived today, and honestly, I'm absolutely blown away. I personally don't like dealing with resin, so having someone else do it for me was absolutely fantastic, and something even more cool, they sanded every single part so that there's no support markings on any of it. It's actually kind of cool. And the process is also really simple. I simply had to go on their website, just drop the files, select the material I wanted, and then they gave me a pretty accurate quote. So if you're looking to prototype some stuff, they can do stuff like FDM, resin, PCBs, even CNC metal. It's a pretty simple process and the parts are just absolutely fantastic. And make sure to use my referral link in the pinned comment and the description, which will give you $5 as a discount. And this is where I got an idea for something a little bit extreme. As I still had the Def Coptic kit around me, I thought, what if I borrow this piece and give him an absolutely titanically sized shoulder pad? This would help to cover up a lot of those issues that I had with the muscle, but then I thought, what if I take it a step further? I took a bit of putty and smushed it around, creating some nice flat pieces, and began tearing off little chunks. And this was going to be my silver bullet that would now solve two problems. Orks have a surprising affinity for clothing, so even though nothing really fits this guy, he still decided to find a bunch of tattered clothes and make himself a very fancy looking cloak. A cloak that was simultaneously gonna hide the connection of where the arm essentially is connecting to the body, as well as make the transition for this massive shoulder pad feel a little bit more organic. And of course, as this guy is a massive hulking savage that realistically only has one functional hand, the pieces of clothing are incredibly tattered and in very small pieces. I will say this is one of my favorite things about this Tamiya putty is that even though you make it very thin and very flimsy, when it dries, this stuff is absolutely solid. Now for the exciting part of trying to find his identity by choosing him the right head. I went through many different options trying to find something that felt right, and right as I landed on this one, which I thought was pretty good, I found something which was even better. Because this head heavily reminded me of the Dawn of War 1 trailer, which was one of my first introductions to 40K, which after checking was somehow 20 years ago. Now overall he was already looking much better, but it was time to do a little bit of accessorizing. Starting with a backup weapon for a grot that's gonna be located on one of those massive tusks. And of course, everybody needs tactical pouches, especially when your pants do not have any pockets because you never know when you might find some trinkets you definitely want to keep. And of course, he's gonna carry with him his once favorite choppa that he's no longer able to use on the account of, having only one functional hand. But it's his and no git is gonna take it from him. Now, I was mostly satisfied with how he looked, but I wanted to add one tiny additional detail by attaching a nice pair of cables to the back of his skull. Now, while at the hobby store, I also picked up this corrosion texture for making interactive. It's basically sand inside of some paint, but it does work really well. You're meant to apply it after you already began painting the model, but I actually found that applying it onto the bare plastic itself, you can do something a little bit more interesting with it. Orkish equipment is meant to be made from scraps they found around them. However, most of the time they do look incredibly clean and polished, so I wanted to really try to give a lot more gritty texture to this armor. In part because you are applying such thin layers, it does dry very fast, so you don't need to wait long to start working on the rest of it. As we'll be keeping him on the 40mm base, I did end up designing a much bigger base topper to give it a bit more presence. Something I nearly missed is that the original miniature has a random key on a chain which really doesn't fit an ork, so instead I glued something a little bit more appropriate. Comparing him to the original, he definitely felt a lot more like Squig Ork and something that I was satisfied with. Now for painting his skin tone, I wanted to try something a little bit different. Instead of starting with my usual color, I went with olive green, and with every single layer mixing in a bit of frog green. This created a very pleasant color that reminded me of a summertime leaf. Pushing the skin tone further in that direction, I began to add a yellow highlight. Perhaps going for a radioactive skin color would have been better, but I just really enjoyed how pleasant it seemed. Then I used Orkish Dermis as my favorite complementary color to all of their skin tones. Next, I really wanted to use some plague bear flesh as essentially a wash to provide a bit more definition, but as it was out of flow aid, I decided to try and use glazing medium, which I assumed would act in a similar way, preventing it from pooling on the surface and not staining the surface as much as regular contrast. Because like the name would suggest, it's glazing medium, so it's good at doing the complete opposite of what I was trying to achieve. In fact, it created such a strong staining effect that the entire miniature had shifted its color drastically. What's worse than that is that it's incredibly glossy. And if I read even for a quick second, I could see it stated right here. This stuff is very glossy. Unfortunately, I glossed over that, and as a result, I had a miniature that was so shiny, I could barely even tell what was happening on the surface of it. So I thought, I really messed up. I should have experimented at least a little bit with this stuff before trying it on, but I thought I'd push on. I tried a variety of different contrast paints to try and shift the color just a little bit, and in the end, it actually didn't turn out that bad. When I finally applied a matte varnish and all the gloss had disappeared, what I was left with was actually really cool. I thought the skin color turned out very nice, despite being entirely different than what I was trying to achieve originally, which was much closer to my Orkenstein. This still looked really nice, but obviously in a different way. Because the new skin tone was in a completely different style from what I had pictured, it really would not have worked with my color scheme. So I ended up choosing a lot of different complementary colors that will provide a vastly different feel. For the wrapping of the staff, originally I thought I'd going for this very brownish leatherish color. However, going with this very cold turquoise color worked out a little bit better, as the skin tone just had a much warmer tone. For the massive Titanic shoulder pad, I really did get a little bit too overambitious with my colors, and I went for an incredibly saturated looking blue color. I used a Liquitex paint that has such rich pigments that compared to the rest of the miniature, it really felt like it was almost glowing. On its own, I really did enjoy it, but because it's on this miniature, it was drawing all the attention towards it, and that's just not something I thought was working well. So instead, I painted this very rusty looking color on top of it, and then used a black wash color over all of the rust elements. The combination of that corrosion texture with the wash really made those relatively flat looking panels look incredibly three-dimensional. Not to mention, it just made each of those armor panels feel so much heavier and almost as if a regular human being wouldn't be able to lift a single one of them. Then for the red, I really do enjoy making it seem as if the red elements of their armor are powered and charged by the Waaagh energy itself, which is what's responsible for making this incredibly slow-looking hulking monstrosity move at speeds that otherwise should not be possible. Now, I intended the blue shoulder pad to be the reference to Spider-Man obviously, but as that was gone now, I decided to shift the blue tone to the cloth itself, which, come to think of it, is actually even a better way to reference that. And it honestly just looked way better than what I previously had in my mind. I knew I wanted an OSL effect similar to what I had in Orkenstein, so I designed a small little essentially light bulb that is going to be on the ground level. The only thing I really should not have done was use the corrosive texture over everything on the base, because when it came to OSL, it did make it look a little bit rougher than it should have. But after applying the wash, it really smoothed things out. Then for the last step, I applied a metallic over the rusted areas. But with that, the amazing Squig Ork was done. The champion of the Waaagh was ready to take his place. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
3, 2, 1, 0.